Thank you for joining us at this January 2020 meeting of the Philadelphia chapter of WCD. I'm Trish Ulrich. I am co-chair of the chapter along with Denise Devine and Suzanne Rowland. Our topic this evening is Board Oversight of CEO Political Speak. 2020 will prove to be an interesting year as the presidential campaign heightens, climate change continues to reveal itself in various ways, and the Me Too campaign continues, and other societal issues are in the media. We welcome back Holly Gregory, co-chair of Sidley's Global Corporate Governance and Executive Compensation Practice, who's going to speak to us about the board oversight of the CEO speaking out on important societal issues. CEO activism comes with both risks and rewards for the company, and some questions we hope Holly will address include: should CEOs take a public position on societal issues that are not overly tied to their bottom lines? Do Americans believe that CEOs have a duty to speak up on contentious issues? And do Americans favor CEOs who voice their opinions, and are they likely to buy the products and services from the companies that take a stand? So with that, let me hand the floor over to Holly.
I'm really happy to be here with you all this evening. This is a really interesting topic. It's a topic that I first started thinking about 3 years ago, as I was seeing more and more kind of reaction by CEOs very publicly to events that didn't seem intimately tied to a company's bottom line. And I thought, boy, I wonder how involved the board is in deciding whether and when the CEO should talk about this. What kind of oversight mechanisms are out there? So I started thinking about it and paying more attention to it and doing some writing about it. And interestingly, there's now a body of research around this. So there's beginning to be a literature that's developing, and I'll touch into some of that today. But there's no doubt that corporate leaders are speaking out more frequently on matters of social and political importance. And I want to define our term. When these issues are not directly linked to the bottom line, this has been called CEO activism. So when we use that term, and when you see that term used in the press, what they're talking about is times when CEOs are talking out on an issue and it's not clearly linked to the business of the corporation, to its bottom line in a fairly immediate sense. Now, CEO activism in a way is kind of a natural response to the increased focus we're seeing from investors and from employees and from customers on the corporate purpose, what are corporations for, and corporate social responsibility. But I think it's also reflective of an era of increasing political and cultural polarization on issues of inequality and race and social justice and climate change, and I'm sure there are more that we can add to that list. The key question to me from a corporate governance perspective relates to who decides whether to speak out and when to speak out. Who decides when it's in the corporation's interest to take a stand on an issue? Is this a matter for the shareholders? Is it a matter for boards? Is it a matter for the management team, for the CEO? And what are the oversight mechanisms in place if this is really a matter for the management team? Who's providing guidance? What are the guardrails that are established for this? Now, I'm going to tell you my own bias. I view this activity as really in the purview of the CEO as the spokesperson for the company in most situations, but with clear guardrails and guidance from the board of directors. So we'll talk about that in a bit. What do I mean by that? So there's no doubt that we're seeing increased interest by employees, customers, investors, and CEOs themselves on the corporation's purpose in society. Millennials want to work for establishments that they think capture their values. They want to feel like they're engaged in purpose and that work has meaning. We know that from numerous surveys and anecdotally from our children and in some situations grandchildren. Customers are increasingly looked to spend their dollars in a purposeful way, in ways that they can justify as responsible. And investors are really directing significant funds now into socially responsible investment funds. That whole area of investment has grown hugely just in the last 5 years. Then you've got CEOs of very large institutional investors like Larry Fink at BlackRock and Bill McNabb at Vanguard, who are engaging with the CEOs of the portfolio companies on their role in society. And they're asking questions in their annual letters that they write to all of the CEOs of portfolio companies. They're asking questions like, how do you describe your corporate purpose? And how do you help your employees share your vision for the company's role in strategy? How does purpose shape your long-term strategy? How does your future strategy act on that purpose? And that's a quote from the letter that Bill McNabb at Vanguard wrote. Now, in August of just a few months ago, both Larry Fink and Bill McNabb joined with 181 other CEOs of large public companies in signing the Business Roundtable statement on the purpose of the corporation. And you may all be familiar with it. I had the great honor to work with the Business Roundtable and advise them on that statement. The statement emphasizes that companies really serve a public good. Companies are here to serve a social need by filling something, providing something, making something that members of society need or want. That's why we've allowed them to incorporate. And so at the very heart of the corporate being is this notion of providing something that's going to benefit society through the goods and services that are provided. The statement emphasized that. That was the starting point for the BRT statement. And it emphasized that companies serve a public good when they fulfill this need, but each company, of course, defines its own special corporate purpose, whether it's providing health care or generating energy or providing transportation or producing food. And along with doing that, they're also innovating and employing people and hopefully paying taxes and doing all kinds of other good things. The statement also recognizes that for corporations to succeed, to remain durable or to sustain for the long term, and to create value over the long term, they have to consider the fair interests of a whole host of constituents, not just shareholders, but also their employees, their consumers, their suppliers, society at large, regulators, a whole host of constituents who have an interest in the corporation and whose fair expectations need to be met in order to retain trust, which really is that license for doing business. Now, satisfying the interests of key constituents and acting in a responsible manner, clearly in the mind of the 183 CEOs who signed this document, is critical to competitive success, to corporate reputation, and to operational effectiveness. Now, this all echoes a theme that if you look at Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, if you look at his letters to portfolio companies, is embedded in the last couple of years. And I'll state one of them. He said, purpose is not a mere tagline or marketing campaign. It's a company's fundamental reason for being, what it does every day to create value for its stakeholders. Purpose is not the sole pursuit of profits, but the animating force of achieving them. So this notion that the corporation plays an important purpose in society, I think, is partially extending into this new kind of activism that we're seeing from CEOs. And I'll explain that in a bit. But there's recent survey data that shows that the public expects leadership from CEOs on key social issues. According to a survey of over 1,000 consumers, 77% agreed that CEOs should speak out when the company's values are violated or threatened. Values. Nearly half agreed that companies should take positions on social issues that they consider important to their workforce and to society, even if it's not directly related to the business. So half of those polled. And nearly half also said that they'd be more likely to purchase a product from a company whose CEO speaks out on issues that they agree with. Now, the flip side of that is the risk. It means there's another 50%, or you're going to have that same people who are not enamored to buy products from a company whose CEO speaks out on issues they disagree with. So that's the risk. That said, in a survey that Edelman, the survey I just quoted from was Weber Shandwick and KRC Research. But Edelman, the big PR firm, also did a survey, and they found that more than half of consumers in all generations are now belief-driven in their consumption. So we're seeing this change in how consumers react. We're seeing a change in how employees react. And I think we're going to see more pressure for CEOs to speak out on important social issues and not less. And so then the issue becomes, how do we figure out what the impact is going to be and whether this is going to be beneficial or detrimental? And is there a cost to silence? There may be a cost to silence in some situations. So we're seeing this engagement. We're not saying it's never happened before. There is earlier precedent. Back in the early 1900s, there were occasions of CEOs speaking out against capital punishment. And then if you look in the 1960s, you see some CEOs speaking out in favor of civil rights. And then in the 1980s, you see some CEOs talking about supporting affirmative action. But anecdotally, at least, it seems that things are really escalating right now. And I think that it may have to do a little bit with the tensions and the culture wars that we're seeing. You may recall in about 2012, there were two high-profile CEOs who came out very publicly on different sides of gay marriage. But the more recent examples of issues that have given rise to CEO activism include race relations, including hate speech evidenced in the protests in Charlottesville, Virginia, gender inequality, refugee treatment and immigration policy, especially including the family separations at the southern border, climate change and related policy, the intersection of religious rights and LGBTQ protections, gun violence and gun control. Now, recent research by Aaron Chatterjee of the Fuqua School of Business at Duke and Michael Toffel at Harvard Business School indicates that CEO statements not only help frame the public discourse, but they do shape public opinion. In a controlled experiment, they looked at how Apple CEO Tim Cook's statements about the potential discrimination in the Indiana Religious Freedom Restoration Act affected the views of individuals. You may recall that act was one that said you could decline to provide services to someone if you felt that it offended your religious beliefs. The examples are all those bakers who were asked to bake cakes for gay marriages and who were saying they didn't want to do it. In this controlled experiment, they found that if a listener heard Cook's statement about his concerns about the prejudicial impact, they were far more likely to say that they were against this law than if they hadn't heard that. So it shows that there is an impact. So given that there's an impact in the public sphere, given expectations of consumers and employees around these issues and investors, how do you move this forward? And when does a CEO speak? And especially given the risk that if you get it wrong, you could offend a large segment of your consumers and employees and investors. And I think the answer is we don't have an answer. It's going to vary. And there's a risk that some constituents will be offended when a corporate leader takes a stand, especially when the link between the issue and the business isn't clear. But there are times when a failure to take a position can also expose a company to criticism. And so while the board is responsible generally for, delegating to management the speaking for the company, it's important for boards to think about these issues and to think about what have we delegated? What is our expectation about what the CEO is doing? Have we had a clear conversation with the CEO about where we see the limits, when we would want to be consulted on these kinds of issues so that we're not surprised? And with that in line, are there processes or guardrails that a board can put in place? How many of you have had this conversation on your boards? Very few.
No one?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a new issue, and I think it's, it's the companies that have been doing it so far are the largest, Fortune 100 and above. But as with issues like political spending and political lobbying, this is something that the board probably wants to have some discussion around so that you understand. For example, you may have a CEO who tweets. You may not really be aware of it. And CEOs tweeting may think that they're tweeting in their own capacity and expressing their own opinions. But given the fact that a CEO is so closely associated with a company, you really have to ask whether that's a fair expectation and whether the board shouldn't have some understanding of how is the CEO using social media in their personal capacity, and do we need some understandings to make sure that they are not out there on issues without having at least had a chance to vet it and think about the impact on the company. Now, it seems like an abridgment of like free speech, doesn't it? To talk about that. But remember, free speech is only free speech vis-a-vis the government. Companies have certain rights to set policies around, especially when the corporate reputation is at stake and the issue of connection of executive to a company could be made by the listener. So some practical guidance. Boards need to really have a talk about how we're going to handle these kinds of issues. How do we determine what issues to speak out on in what circumstances, and whether to act individually or in concert? You may recall that, and then you always have this choice, right? Do I get out there ahead of it and talk about something? Do we wait and find a group to participate in and sort of allows us to ride low in the saddle in the middle of the pack, and offer that protection of numbers? If you'll recall back, I think it was in 2015, a large number of CEOs of major companies got together and very publicly spoke out about what they were hoping would come out of the Paris Accord on climate change. And they did it as a group. Gives everybody a little bit of protection and cover. But those are the kinds of issues to talk about. So I have a couple of points to make about some of the things that you can do. I think it's helpful to have a group within the company that is designated in advance, and this is very much in line with already your corporate communications programs, to talk about who gets together, how would we identify a situation where it might make sense for the company to speak. These events can come up quickly in unusual circumstances, and they're not always going to have a lot of time for planning, because sometimes the opportunity is ripe and it's right for the company to come out and say something. You may recall in the aftermath, for example, of the some of the school shootings, the school shooting in Florida. There were a couple of airlines who had special programs with the NRA giving discounts to members, and they decided to pull those back. Well, that's the kind of issue. It's not directly linked to their bottom line. It's a very public statement. What kind of vetting do we do in those kinds of situations? And by the way, I'm not talking about a lot of specific companies, because we are on video, and my law firm would make me vet every reference to make sure that they're not a client and that I'm not getting into trouble. So forgive me for the generalities in a way. So I do think it's good to have a sense of what are the issues that might be important to us? What are our values that we really have made a point of expressing to our employees and to our other constituents? And what's happening out in the world right now that could be impacting those values? Are there areas that we want to be watching? Maybe it's not ripe now. Maybe for some of us, we're smaller companies, and we probably won't get out there actively, but we just need to make sure that we have a common expectation with the CEO. One of the most important things we know about speaking out on issues is the importance of credibility. And so having some discussion ahead of time about understanding where are our values, what do we really care about, and how do we make sure that we maintain credibility both in our speech and frankly in our silence can be a good exercise. This is not an exercise I think the board needs to be engaged in. I think the board's role is more about setting expectations and talking about processes and making sure that the CEO understands when the board would want to be engaged in these kinds of issues. But that said, there's a lot of work that can be done internally within the company by bringing together the CEO, the general counsel, the key communications people, the relevant leaders, government community relations folks, investor relations folks. Just have this discussion, identifying political or social issues that may at some point touch on interests of the company. And in that discussion, determining what things are kind of central and what things are more remote. Do we know what our employees really care about? For example, in Silicon Valley, there have been companies that have been pushed to make public statements on issues of social importance because their employees really care about it, and they've had grassroots efforts within the company by the employees to push for these kinds of things. This group also has to be, we need a group that's going to really look at, what are the potential upsides and downsides? Do we really understand the risk once we're focused on a message that we may want to speak out on? Or do we understand the risks of not speaking? Again, if you think about some of the pressures that came in the Silicon Valley companies with because of the DACA situation and great pressure from employees to be out there on that issue. Before they came out, I'm sure they had to think about what happens if we don't speak. Well, now we've got internal pressures. What does that say to our employees? How are we going to deal with that? I do think that then you want to have an advance, and many companies already have this built into their communications protocols. How are we going to prepare and assess the company's response to an issue or the message? Is it just the CEO out there, he's gotten the green light and he can go say it, or do we still need to think about how is the message constructed, how is it delivered? How do we articulate the issue, why this is important to the company, so that we ensure that if we're going to talk, we have to be really credible about an issue? And how do we prepare for some of the questions that we may get from key constituents, including constituents who are not happy, because there will be some pushback potentially. So those are the kinds of things that I'm seeing companies begin to think about. And I thought I'd share that with you all today, and I look forward to a discussion.
Curious, if you think about the fact that there's very little research on this yet, but for a public company, is there any evidence that it has an impact on stock price and the ramifications of that?
There is anecdotal evidence that there has been stock price impacts. And again, I'm a little hampered because I'm not free to talk specific companies. But I haven't seen an academic study yet looking at specific stock price. But you can see, so in the airline situation, there were some stock price moments kind of immediately, or there have been some sporting goods entities that have made big announcements, and you see some, but I don't think it's long-term price movements. And in some cases, there's been some slow positive trends. So I think it's a really important question to ask, and it's something that I think a company's investor relations and other professionals need to be thinking about in those contexts.
So it seems to me, would you recommend if a company, should they be aware of their consumer base, maybe in the categories their consumers fall into, before they would, suggest thinking about making a public statement? For example, if you were going to speak up on Me Too and your constituents are all women, you're probably, more aligned with consumer thinking, right? Is there any evidence to suggest that you should be aligned with your customers' thoughts?
Absolutely. I mean, I think what you have to recognize is you've got a variety of constituents who may have a viewpoint or an interest. And certainly one is your consumers. Another one is your investors. You're going to want to have some ear to the ground, your employees clearly. Employees are driving a lot of this as well. I don't think it's, and in line with the BRT's corporate purpose statement, there are many constituents who have a fair interest in the efforts of a corporation. And so part of the task is management having their ear to the ground and understanding who's interested in these kinds of issues and how are they likely to respond. Now, you're not always going to get it directly. And there are some situations where you management or the board may feel that something is so much the right thing and in line with our values that we're going to move forward even though there may be some fallout, and we're going to have to work hard to articulate our actions in line with our values and deal with the fallout.
So as you spoke, it struck me that the organization having clarity on its values and its vision for how it fits into society and globally is really critically important. And it seems to me that this very much dovetails from the perspective of the board with the board's responsibilities for helping to drive corporate culture in the first place. And I'd be interested in your comment on how meeting governance responsibilities also includes developing that clear understanding of what corporate values are and the broader culture of the company, not just the CEO and any political statements she might make.
I couldn't agree more vehemently with what you've said. And I think one of the nice things about the current focus that the BRT statement put on this issue of corporate purpose and the letters from people like Larry Fink and Bill McNabb as CEOs of large institutional investors, it's really challenging companies and boards to step back and think about what are our values and what is our purpose and what are we trying to do. We've been tied up for a decade or two in this rhetoric around shareholder value and profit as being the purpose of the corporation. And what we're being challenged to do is to get, that's a goal. Yes, that's a goal. But is it a purpose? Is it a purpose that motivates us? Does it really describe why we're here and why we were created? There's something more fundamental that's the value that we bring to society. I think that, though, these are hard conversations for boards to have. Boards and managements are focused on the here and now. We know how hard it is to think about even getting that periodic discussion about long-term strategy, because there's so much on the plate. There's so much to do today. Board meetings are so long, there's so much material, that this seems all kinds of like fluffy and philosophical. But I think it's really important. And I think that we're finally starting to have that discussion as we get away from, again, what I see as kind of a strict rhetorical limits around shareholder value as being the sole determinant. We see not only in the number of investors who are going into socially responsible funds and the number of consumers who are saying that their consumption is purpose and value driven. That's only going to increase. And so I think it's forcing a little bit more of a serious conversation. But I think directors have to bring it into the boardroom at times and say, we really need to talk about it. And when I talk about the values, I'm not talking about like what you see in nonprofits with this endless focus on the mission statement that just like makes me want to shoot myself. And not to say it's not important to understand your mission, but they kind of never get out of it. For-profit boards don't really get into it enough, so we've got this dichotomy. And I think that that's what a lot of this discussion is about that's beginning to happen now.
How receptive are CEOs to the board's idea that it should now begin to create some guardrails, if you will, about what kind of issues should be discussed in public, and et cetera.
Yeah.
And how would you suggest that a board initiate that kind
Yeah.
of discussion?
I don't know that I would start it by saying we need guardrails, but I would, I would do it more along the lines of inviting a conversation about what are our expectations and how I would, as a board member, I'd want to understand the CEO and management's view currently of how they engage on social and political issues. Have they just not engaged? Have they not engaged because it's just not an issue that came up, or is that a concerted decision not to engage? I'd start there with how have we done it. One place where it's an easy segue from is a discussion around the corporate policies that apply to corporate political spending and lobbying. And that's another discussion that certainly should be happening now, especially with an election year coming up, and with the huge amount of focus that we know shareholders have on these issues. So I think I'd start, if I was tentative and was worried a little bit about the backlashes, I might fold this into a conversation about where do our policies stand on corporate lobbying and political activity? How has the company engaged in that kind of activity? What kinds of disclosures do we make around that activity? That's a good one for a board periodically to have a refresh on, do we continue to be satisfied that we have the right policies in place? And then this is an add-on. In some companies that I've worked at, it's come up because a board member has seen a tweet from a CEO that they've gone, maybe we need to have this conversation. Nothing really bad yet, but this seems to be bordering on issues that could read as more than clearly personal to the CEO. It could have a reputational impact for the company. So that's another kind of entry point. And I guess you could talk about it when you talk about policies around use of social media by senior executives.
I think Nancy's next.
Yeah, most CEOs are not really in the public eye very often. And one of the vehicles where they typically in the past have talked about values and the like is in their annual letter to shareholders. And have you seen a change in the content of those annual letters recently? Because most of the time they review the year that just gone by, and they'll make a couple of standard comments about values and people and that kind of thing. But I haven't noticed a lot of change in those letters. That number one. And number two, since the Business Roundtable signature letter came out, have you seen any evidence of changes in compensation metrics or anything like that where, the old adage of put your money where your mouth is? Have you seen any changes in that either?
So two really good questions. The first question, that would be a great academic study for somebody to go take a look at those CEO letters and think about an audience, what an audience to look at and to try to assess what kind of change is happening in what companies are talking about. I think a lot of the CEO activism that has spurred this interest and issue has been very situational driven. So something has happened out in the world where a company feels that they need to speak out to be consistent with their values. So, for example, around the Indiana religious freedom law for companies that had major operations in Indiana and employees who were felt that it was an issue, or you may remember the bathroom laws in one of the Carolinas, right? Where companies felt like we really need to speak out. I wouldn't expect that kind of issue to get embedded in a CEO's letter in the proxy statement or annual report, because it's still kind of kind of marginal to the business given how they focus. But it will be interesting to see what I'm hoping to see is them start talking more about our purpose. How do we view the company and what the social good is that we bring through the products and services that we're offering? I think we will see some change there. On the compensation front, I would punt and say it's maybe too early to tell. And I do know that there is follow-on activity that is planned, but I'm not at liberty to talk about that, right now. But I think that's a good one to, keep an eye on. I do think one of the big issues that the BRT statement brings forward is this notion that the interests of the broad range of constituents, the shareholders, employees, customers, suppliers, society, tend to align over the long term. It's in the short term where we see the trade-offs and the pressures. And so how do you help to focus in on, how the board adds to the discussion around what is our long-term strategy? How do we view the value that we bring to this range of constituents over a long term is going to be an issue to have conversations about. So that's my punting. I'm sorry, I can't be more direct than that.
So I'm wondering if you think this is a broader trend than just if the CEO speaks out on political issues. So it goes to your comments about political activities of the company. Mm-hmm. So, for example, a company that clearly has its objective and mission stated, they follow that in their policies, mm-hmm. employees are clear about it, and yet the company sponsors a pact where politicians are highly supportive of the industry, which is mm-hmm. certainly helpful to investors, but some of those politicians, have positions contrary to the company's mm-hmm. stated objectives.
Well, we've seen instances of that in the past, and they've been called out, and very publicly so, and it's very embarrassing. And I think that's one of the reasons why so many companies have put in much stricter kinds of policies around what kinds of corporate political spending they will do. There are a number of companies now that don't give to individual politicians or the PACs. Now, I think that approach is more common among very, very large public companies, less so in sort of the mid-range Russell 3000. But we're seeing more companies really get that, we could give money to this politician and they could be great on X, Y, and Z that has to do with our business. But then they might come out with one of these bathroom bills or LGBT, and embarrass us. And there are watchdog groups who are watching for that and are going to make every effort that they can to bring it forward and to the potential harm of the company's reputation. So these are really hard issues. And I always fall back on the board having good discussions and periodically going over the policies that the company has, the internal controls that you've put in place to make sure that there's not rogue activity in the area of political contributions and lobbying.
As a board member, I think that I would have a preference that my CEO is not out there holding forth mm-hmm. on political issues, because I think the risks are just so mm-hmm. much greater than anything positive that can come of it. But that being said, I think the board probably should. It sounded like you were suggesting that it's really a management issue as opposed to a board issue, and I'd like to hear you elaborate on a little, because sure. I think it should be a board issue. I think it's something that the board should be a part of, mm-hmm. and it could be that other board members would feel like it's okay to have. Mm-hmm. But I think with your lobbying, you've got plenty of opportunities for the company to hold forth, mm-hmm. and in most big companies, they're going to give to both. To both parties. Mm-hmm. I'd just like to hear you elaborate a little bit more.
I want to be very clear. I think that it's common for a board to delegate to the CEO the role of being the active spokesperson for the company. But that isn't a role that's unfettered and without guardrails. And so I would agree with you. What I worry about is the rogue CEO who thinks it's all his or her decision and is just going out and doing it without having had a discussion with the board around, what are the types of situations where we may get engaged on these issues? If something is happening in the news that's highly newsworthy, what are we going to do? I'll give you an example without giving you an example. You may recall that in the wake of the Charlottesville in Virginia with the hate speech and the demonstration there, and reaction from senior administration officials that there were good people on both sides. Several members of presidential advisory committees who were CEOs of major companies publicly stepped down. Now, I think in the situations I'm aware of, the decision to do that was a very personal decision, but it was at the same time shared with the board in advance. Now, we can call that CEO activism. Certainly has had potential for risk, but it was grounded in values that the CEO and the company shared. And so you make a decision that, sometimes we can't stand on the sidelines and sometimes we can't be silent. And I think that's what a lot of this is about. I think we're in an unusual period of time where there are often people who are in corporate leadership roles who are saying, how comfortable can we be on the sidelines? DACA is another example. So those are the...
I think you mentioned a group in the company that might be responsible. Would that be something like a crisis response group who would be looking at some of these issues and bringing the ones forward that could warrant a stand?
So I think the same mechanisms that companies have for crisis response may be the right sets of people to think about, because you could think about this as a crisis. Something happens, and if we don't say something, are we standing on the sidelines in a way that we could really be criticized for? But if we do say something, could we also really be criticized? And how do we figure that out? Sometimes in a short period of time, because there's a time to act or not act. And it's going to be probably the same kind of team that you bring together for crisis response. So it's going to include your, CEO, CFO, people who can speak to investor relations, your communications experts, your HR experts, if it reads on things that matter to your employment base, general counsel, those kinds of very high level crisis response people.
We talk about the corporate values, and then most companies now are doing an ESG statement. How are they similar, or how are they different when you kind of take a stand in like an ESG space versus maybe something that's not political but is social?
So I think that these things are all, that's a great question. They're all melding together. And what we know right now is, again, investors and consumers and employees are driving companies to be much more transparent and articulate about how they approach issues around environmental, social, and governance responsibility. And here, there are environmental and social issues that the company just interacts with because it's taking actions that have impacts. All corporations have issues around gender equality. It's just an issue, right? And so it's a social issue that companies have to think about. How are we going to position ourselves, and what are we going to say? What are we going to disclose about things like compensation parity? Maybe we're not because we haven't been asked. Maybe we are. We're going to include it in an ESG kind of response or a report where we talk about also things like environmental impact and how we mitigate it. I think it relates highly to values. I mean, because you want to have, I mean, it's really to your point. If, you gotta walk the talk, right? If we're going to have values, we have to think about how do we reflect those values in our actions. And I think for many companies, this ESG transparency is relatively new, but I think it's going to fit into this whole discussion around what is our purpose, how do we articulate our values, how are we credible, and recognizing that sometimes we're going to be aspirational, knowing that the immediate criticism might be, well, what are you doing on this particular issue right now? Where sometimes it's going to be, that's down the road, we're going to need to look at it, we've got other things in mind. And I think that's the problem with values. Values are really broad, and then they're also in the mind of the beholder. And you can take any specific instance and say, well, how does that thing that you just did marry up with your values, right?
So an example, Holly, that I'm thinking of as we bring this topic up is the hotel industry. Human trafficking is obviously a societal issue that they have to be very cognizant of. And I happen to know as an industry, they have training programs and whatnot for their employees to deal with it. And then you have a particular situation that occurs like the Epstein situation. So in your guidance, the board should be speaking with the CEO on, well, do we address that Epstein news media situation, or is it just in our best interest, even though we are very active in preventing human trafficking, that we don't speak on that? So that might be an example of where you would get in as a board member into putting some guardrails around what you might want to address or not address. Even though it's a topic that you're heavily involved in, it still might be something you don't want to talk about.
Yeah, and the Epstein one, I mean, I don't think I've seen any companies really come forward and express that. You've seen it more in the Me Too situation. Some companies coming forward talking about the programs that they have in place, et cetera. But I would think, we know that in the disclosures in the hotel industry and in the airline industry, they do report out on the kinds of training that they provide to their frontline people to help them identify situations and think about how to deal with it. I think every company is going to be really unique in this, and I don't want anybody to think what I'm not calling for CEOs to get out there and comment on things like that. Again, there's this issue of when is it credible and important and compelling that we speak, because it's in those situations that we're most effective. It's in those, so you're not just out there commenting on sort of random other things that are happening in the news, but when it comes to the heart. I can see, I wouldn't be surprised if, if there was a CNN thing about, Epstein, and in the context of a broader story on human trafficking, that you might see a CEO of an airline or a hotel be interviewed to talk about the great programs that they have and the training that they do. But
I was just going to add that, we've addressed it a bit, that bellwether is the environmental and climate change issue. And most energy companies, whether they're utilities, oil or gas companies, they are being asked by investors to take a position to reduce their carbon footprint and to include it in a ESG report to investors either annually or biannually.
Right.
I'm finding on a number of my boards, we're talking about it in the nominating and governance committee meetings, where we start to discuss what's the position and why is the company taking that position, and how far we should go and what we should be saying. So for those of us who are looking at industries that are actually taking political positions, energy, utilities, and industrial companies are really coming out and taking a position on carbon reduction.
I just wanted to ask you whether you're familiar with public benefit corporations, which is, they exist in Pennsylvania, and they're somewhere in between a regular for-profit and a not-for-profit. I'm on the board of a newspaper, and it is a PBC, which is allowed to take into account the other interests in the community, the employees. We happen to be owned by a not-for-profit, so we don't have any dividend requirements, but it's a kind of, on that scale, an important
Yeah, there are a
topic.
number of new kinds of corporate entities that are being explored, and one is the public benefit corporation, and Delaware has it, Pennsylvania has it. I would note that in Pennsylvania, you already have a constituency statute that makes clear that your for-profit corporations, your normal corporations, can take into account a broad range of constituents. I haven't studied the public benefit form in great depth, and I'm not yet clear who will be enforcing the right. So the big fear with a classic corporation is that there's some decision before the board, and the board makes a decision to go one way, and a shareholder comes in and says, you breached your duty because you gave undue weight to some consideration, and this is not really about shareholder value. That's the concern. And as I understand, in the public benefit corporation, it's still the shareholder who has to come in and sort of enforce this duty. And so it's going to be interesting to see how those all play out.
Obviously pretty new.
It's pretty new. It's interesting. It's intriguing. There are a couple of variations on them. The statutes are about 5-6 years old, so they're really pretty new. But it's interesting to hear that corporations are. I have my son who's 29 has a schoolmate who just started one that is geared toward helping people, when they've lost a loved one, figure out all the things you have to take care of. And it's a corporation that's designed with a lot of high technology to help in that, how do we organize in the midst of our grief all of the many, many decisions that have to be made. And she organized it as a public benefit corporation.
Another observation that I have is that this is really tightly related to a previous speaker that we had when Erica Karp from Cornerstone came in and talked about corporate sustainability. And to me, if a corporation isn't tuned in to how this is evolving, they are in fact putting their long-term success at risk. Strikes me that that is the solid defense to a shareholder who claims that they're not acting in the best interest of the corporation. It really becomes a question of time horizons.
Right.
And for the corporation to sustain into the future, more and more they're going to have to be clear.
I absolutely agree with you. And I think when we talk about issues of corporate sustainability outside of just the purely environmental, because remember the word sustainable was first about the environment, but it's come to mean how do we ensure that this corporation can withstand the risks and have and evolve its strategy so that it can be around for the long term, so it can sustain. So I like to call it being durable. How do we make sure it's durable? And that it's going to change with the times, get a good sense that we're not going to be making buggy whips, but we're going to understand the horizon and all of what that means. And in the environmental context, we've heard a lot of it came about because people were saying, well, what if you're a company and you use a lot of water and no longer have water? How is it going to change if these big impacts come to fruition? So I agree with you. I think the way to really get to these issues again is for boards to help management focus in on the longer term horizon, both with respect to strategy and risks and impacts and geopolitics and what might happen next and what does the world look like if, and yet it's hard to reserve boardroom time for that because it's kind of mushy, right? And it's not the bottom line. But how many of your companies are walking away from giving quarterly guidance? Trying, right? I mean, so if we want to talk about long-term versus short-term, the Aspen Institute, any number of other groups have come out and said, look, this giving quarterly guidance and then managing to the guidance is probably not the best way to manage a company for the longer term, because it means that you've always got those blinders that are looking pretty immediately on decisions that are going to drive in the next quarter, rather than making the investments that are going to be necessary for 2, 3, 5 years out. I think we need to be having more of that discussion, and that's an interesting. Have you been talking about that in your boardrooms? Because that's a big one. Or how does our compensation program and our performance compensation, what time horizons are we looking at? Are we incentivizing the right kind of behavior that we want? How do our incentive programs look at things like how well corporate management embodies and drives the corporate values and the culture that we want? Those are really difficult issues, and they're just the most difficult issues, both to get real attention on the agenda and to have solid discussions and decisions around.
Do you see a crossover in reference to this conversation affecting private equity or private companies? Because a lot of them are in the same space and industry, and they thus far have escaped kind of this scrutiny. Do you see, because some of us are on private company boards and so forth?
The old line private company boards were often the boards that really could be long-term thinking, because they didn't have the scrutiny of the public markets with the demands for, the hitting quarterly guidance and ever increasing, share price value. And they could make some of those more difficult decisions. In the private equity context, it starts to get murkier, because now you do have an investor, large investors, who are very, very focused in on depending on the investor. It can be a shorter term, it can be a little bit longer, but at the same time, they often bring great skill sets to really help management prepare for whatever that event is. But I don't think that those boards are having the purpose discussion in the same way, unless they're very, very large entities. I don't know, I'd love to hear your experiences. How many of you are sitting on boards with a private equity investor? Yeah. So, I mean, I would love to hear. I mean,
They don't care.
What did you say?
They don't care.
Can you use the mic?
They don't care until there's going to be an exit strategy someday, and they do have to attract their employees and the consumers. Yeah. So they're, I mean, these are often the boards that we too said 5 years ago, 10 years ago, they were not as sophisticated on internal controls. You get enough regulatory activity, they start to focus on internal controls. You get enough difficulty in attracting the millennials or in selling the product, they'll get with it. We also, with our firm, we do a lot of work with investment managers and private equity people, including private equity where they're investing in a host of entities. And they are beginning to be subject to their own industry pressures to follow on things like the UN principles of responsible investing. And so that window is beginning to happen there. I'm beginning to hear from some of our private equity clients about how do we, how would this work for us if we wanted to sign on to the UN principles. So it may be coming.
Just a related question. Have you seen an increase in derivative lawsuits over the last couple of years?
No. have we seen an increase in the number of derivative lawsuits? Not in the number. There's a new theory, not a new theory. And this would be a great topic for a discussion. In the last year, there have been 2 important cases in Delaware, and those are the courts that really matter when we talk about derivative lawsuits, because if you're not a Delaware corporation, if you ever get sued, your court's going to be looking at this stuff. There are 2 cases where the courts did not dismiss a lawsuit against directors for a breach of duty early on, that in the past we thought was kind of in the zone where it was really hard to bring a case. Now they say bad facts make bad law. In both cases it was really bad facts. One was the Marchand case. It was about ice cream. It was a company that has one product. It sells frozen ice cream and frozen yogurt, a monoline company. And they had a listeria outbreak and people died. Because the ice cream was tainted. And it turned out that the FDA, as well as a state regulator, had informed the company over a period of several years about high levels of listeria in some of the testing that they did. And so the court, rather than dismiss the claims, said there's enough question here about whether the board was focused in on it. There was questions about what the board knew or should have known, and so that case was allowed to go forward. And then another case similar with different facts but around regulatory risk. So I do think we went through a period where it seemed like it was very hard for plaintiffs to prevail on suits against directors, and now we're seeing plaintiffs successfully articulate some theories that the courts have indicated could survive the early motions, which is what you really want is the cases thrown out on the early motions so you as directors don't get deposed and have to go before the cameras.
We migrated a bit away from the topic, I think.
Yes.
Into ESG and other stakeholders besides shareholders, for example. And the question is related to that, but it's really what should the CEO be saying? And how do you describe, how do you create policies that are appropriate for what the CEO is to say about those things? While at the companies I'm on the boards of, we didn't have a board discussion. We did have a discussion in a completely informal, not that informal, but it was a meeting with employees that was about, public activity and charitable activity, and migrated into the whole concept of when should executives be talking about what kind of issues. And we got to a point where clearly executives can talk about the issues that are specific to the company and the company's profitability. And then people could agree that there were certain issues, and Charlottesville was, again, that's the example, but it might be the exception that proves the rule. But Charlottesville had such a cohesion of opinion about it, that was safe and honorable and perhaps the right thing to do. But between those two, there are such a lot of issues where opinions can differ, which are troublesome to think about weighing into.
That's such a great point. And I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting that you could sort of at the outset have a policy and have a menu. You can talk about X and don't talk about Y. Each one of these issues is going to be wholly context dependent. It's the lawyer's answer. We love this answer. It depends, right? It depends. It's based on what's happening and what the issue is and the context in which it arises and where your constituents are and where the pressure's coming from and where does it stand with your values. So you can't have a template that says we'll talk about X, we won't talk about Y, but you can have discussions that help tease out in advance what are the kinds of information we'd want to have. what might drive us down one path versus the other? What else do we need to know? How are we going to get information quickly in these circumstances? What should be our default position? Well, I would suggest if you can't come up with a good reason to speak, normally the default is going to be you don't speak. But then is there another default position of speaking somewhat, or how do we determine when to join with groups, and where should we be being active or being vigilant so we would know when these opportunities come up? So it's very process focused.
Right. I promised Holly that she would get to a specific train, so I think that this is a good entree to a summary here. And if I could take the liberty of summarizing what I think we've heard from you, it's important not to randomly speak about these topics, as you were just highlighting, and to have some credibility when you are speaking, which means the board needs to talk about these things, not just ignore them, but talk about them in the context of the values of the organization. And many of us are probably in a situation in our boards where we've never talked about the values of our organization. So that's a great place to start. And make sure that when we're speaking out, we understand what those guardrails are. When do we want to speak? When don't we want to speak? What are the upsides and downsides of speaking or not speaking? And this is really, I think, an important point that Holly made, is how is the company going to measure the response when we do speak? Many times we go out there and speak, and then we don't really follow up with, well, what was the impact of that speaking? So how are we going to measure that response, and how are we going to be prepared for that response ahead of time with both our happy and non-happy constituents? And what are the potential impacts and implications on our stock price? And I think those are the highlights. I'll leave it to everyone to watch the video again and get all the specific details. Holly, thank you so much. As always, you're a wealth of knowledge, and thank you.